2020. So we started the Book Marketing Action podcast in early 2020. And it's been a bit of a bumpy journey to get started. And so I'm really excited to share some of that journey with you, especially if you're considering starting your own podcast. So as we dive in, I do have a couple of polls that I would like to launch this morning, this afternoon, whatever it is where you are, just to get your feedback on these two questions. So if you could take a moment to answer them. The first question is related to podcasts. I would like to start a podcast, be a guest on other people's podcasts, or both. And the second question is, I listen to podcasts for entertainment and personal interest, on professional related topics. So you listen because you want to learn for things related to your profession, or you don't listen much at all. And I appreciate your feedback. I have never seen the polls go out like this both at once. It's kind of cool. So we'll give you a moment to answer the poll. And thanks to those of you who did answer my email. I had sent an email, so hopefully you received it, just trying to get some feedback about what you're looking for specifically on today's event. And I wanted to do a quick check-in with those of you who may not have had a chance to answer that email. And I see in the chat, all three answers apply. On the second question, I did not say hi before to Randy in Colorado. So hi, Randy in Colorado. All right, so I'll give you a chance to see the results to the poll. It looks like almost half of you want to both start a podcast and be a guest on others' podcasts. So it looks like about, 2/3 of the group today are interested in starting a podcast. And about half of you listen to podcasts on professional topics. And about a third of you don't listen to podcasts much at all. So I would definitely say, as the first action step from today's podcast, if you don't currently listen to podcasts much, what I would encourage you to do is to begin to listen to some podcasts, particularly ones that might be on topics that are similar to the topic that you want to podcast about, so that you can get a sense of what you like. So I mentioned that we started the Book Marketing Action podcast in early 2020. And one of the things that I thought that I would do that we ended up not doing is I thought that we would have a very short, 5 to 7 minute podcast, that it would be just me talking and giving all my advice to people. And what I found out really, really fast is that I absolutely hated that format of talking, to a blank room with no interaction. And so after a few episodes, I invited a colleague of mine, Christy Kirk, and what we would do is we would get together, we would come up with a topic, and then the two of us would have a conversation. And I liked that, slightly more. Christy's really fun, and we had a good time creating some content together. But for me, the podcast really started to take off after about I don't know how many episodes, maybe 25 episodes. We shifted to a model where we had a guest on every episode, and we also had themes. And the guests and the themes together, those two things really helped for me to create some momentum and excitement around doing the podcast. So the first takeaway that I gave you is, if you haven't yet listened to podcasts on the topic that you want to podcast about, start doing that as a means of seeing what's out there and what you like. And then the second one is, you may start out, having listened to podcasts, having a format or an approach in mind, and you may find that that will shift or that you don't like it. And it definitely is a very discovery driven process. So next week on the podcast, the interview that you'll have a chance to hear is with Carrie Green, and Carrie owns a company called Podcast Fast Track. And he gives some really important advice, I think, that I also want to share here. He says that you should never start out, you shouldn't start a podcast unless you're willing to put in a year's worth of effort to see what the experience is like. And I agree with that, because I think it could be really easy to do a few episodes and decide it's not for you, and not really give yourself enough time to build an audience or get traction, or even just get used to the whole approach. When you listen to that episode next week, and I don't want to give it all away, but Carrie also gives the advice that you should record a couple of podcasts, maybe 2-3 podcasts, and throw them out, and then get started with podcasts that you might share with the world. And I might have needed that advice when we first started. It might have been a good idea to throw out my first few efforts. They weren't awesome. I do see a question in the chat from Elizabeth about how do I locate podcasts on career choice and direction and effective job searches. And the best idea I have about that is just go to wherever you listen to podcasts. I use Apple Podcasts for my listening and search keywords. Also, if you're logged into Apple, you should be able to look at various categories and then hone in to find the podcasts on the topics that you're interested in. So let's dive in a little deeper on, kind of the things that you need to know when you start your own podcast. And one of the things that you need to know is that it is a long-term commitment to really both creating content over time and also to establishing audience over time. It's not a thing where if you start a podcast, you'll automatically attract listeners. And I actually interviewed a woman yesterday who has a podcast that I quite enjoyed for entertainment value. And she mentioned that the audience that she had in mind at the beginning is not that the audience that she's actually attracted with her content. So a good exercise whenever you're going to start a new marketing initiative is to really be thinking about a number of different strategic priorities. So the first one is, what's your message? What's the content that you want to create to share with the world? Why are you the right person to create and share that content? What unique point of view do you have? And in what way can you share it to attract the people who need that content? So you want to think about the message and the topic. You also want to think about the target audience. Who are the people who most need to hear from you about that topic? And then you also want to be thinking about format. And as I mentioned, there are all kinds of different ways to do podcasts. Some podcasts that are very short form, like what I thought I would initially do, a few 5 minutes, 10 minutes can be quite popular. And then some people have podcasts that are, up to an hour long. Or maybe even longer than that. For our podcast, we have landed in a format of about 15 to 20-minute interviews, which seems to work well. We can cover a lot of ground. And we sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat and talk to you at the same time. So 15 to 20 minutes is a good sweet spot for me. I think it's short enough that people can listen to it on drives or, just in a bit of time that they might have, and it doesn't require the commitment of an hour long. Okay, so you want to think about your topic, you want to think about your audience, you want to think about your format, and then you also want to really think about the reality of the investment that you might be willing to make with always the 3 resources that we have in limited supply, which are time, energy, and money. So I'm curious, and you can put it in the chat if you like, which of those you think might be most challenging as it relates to starting a podcast. Do you think that time is the most challenging? Do you think that energy is the most challenging? Or do you think that money is the most challenging? I see money, I see energy, then time, and I see time. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this idea of time because I'm seeing time and money, time. I'm seeing energy, I'm seeing all of them, but I'm seeing a lot of time. And so you may be curious about how much time it takes really to create a podcast. So you want to think about this in a few different phases. And those of you who have listened to me talk about marketing know that I talk about book launches in 4 phases, and the same phases really apply to this as well. So the phases are building, working, launching, and advancing. So in the building phase, that's when you're going to decide things like, the topic area, who you want to reach, all of those things. In the working phase, you're going to be putting together all the really kind of basics that you need to begin to start podcasting. So that could include gathering your equipment. That could include starting to seek out the first guests if you're going to do a guest type format. It could include really putting together a marketing plan. So once you've created the content for your podcast, what are you going to do to get it out there and market the podcast? So in the working phase, it's like all the things you have to do to build up. You may want to create a logo for your podcast, of course, so that you have a visual brand that's consistent. You're going to want to select music. You're going to want to record your intros and your outros. You're going to want to think about, what is the call to action for your listeners? What is it that you hope they'll do after listening to your podcast? All of that's going to happen in the working phase. Then most of the best advice I've heard is that you want to launch your podcast with 2 or 3 episodes already recorded so that you can release those all at once, get some downloads starting to happen, get some, early ratings and reviews on your podcast. And so that's all of what you would do to lead up to launch. And I definitely advise that if you start a podcast, you want to launch it just the same way that you would launch a book. And that involves, making sure your networks know about the podcast, gathering some of those early reviews, just like you would Amazon reviews. So you want to be really thinking through, what is that? Now, advancing is everything that happens after the launch. So it really helps to have a process around, how far in advance are you going to record? Are you going to do your own audio editing? Are you going to outsource audio editing? What are all the various kind of weekly things that you need to do? And if you think it sounds like it takes a lot of time, it does. I have a new article out on LinkedIn today in which I talk about my own journey as a podcaster. And, one of the things that I know is that it takes a lot more time even than the time that I see. So as the host of my own podcast, the time that I spend primarily is brainstorming ideas for guests. Sometimes if I know the guest personally, I'm the one who reaches out to ask the guest to schedule with me. Otherwise, my team does that. So at the very tip of what I do is about an hour a week to prepare for and record a 15 to 20-minute episode, and then any other creative time. So that's only 1 hour a week, which sounds like not very much. But then if you want to think about my team behind the scenes and all the various things they do, and I'm going to kind of tick through those quickly for you. So one of the things that my team does is they take the transcript from my recording and they create show notes. And actually what we do is we publish almost an entire transcript that's been edited in case there are people who would rather read the podcast interview than listen to it. And then also at the bottom of that transcript, they include any links to our guests' calls to action. So like our guest's website, our guest social posts, because part of the value of being a guest on a podcast is that chance to be known by a new audience. So the team spends a ton of time on those show notes. Then they also spend a lot of time on creating social graphics and audiograms for every episode. I think there are at least like 5 graphic assets that our team creates. Then they communicate the day of the podcast going live with the guests to let them know. They write all the social content and schedule it out on all our channels. And so I would say the post production part of the marketing of the podcast could easily be 2 more hours a week or 3. I'm not sure, Aubrey, what you think, if you can put that in the chat for our guests. So there's a lot of work that goes into a podcast. And the other thing to tell you is that our team does not do our own audio editing. So kind of the mixing to get the music and the intros and the outros, we pay an outside company to do that. And so if you're doing your own kind of audio mixing and editing, then you have to also take that time commitment into account. So, back in the day when everyone was blogging, people would talk about, well, how long does it take to write a blog post? And, I would always try to keep my commitment to writing blog posts within an hour also. But what I'm seeing in the chat from Aubrey is our team easily spends 3 to 5 hours per episode on our podcast, plus the hour that I spend, plus the content organizing and planning. So those of you who said, oh, one of my hesitations about having a podcast is time. Yeah, I hear that. And so the thing that you can do is trade out, right? You can trade out time for money. And so you can choose to outsource many of the things that I have my team do to a team like ours, or to another resource that you might have. So I hope that's helpful in terms of really thinking through the investment as it relates to startup kind of costs. In the article that I'm going to share with you that I published on LinkedIn, I talk about the fact that we bought some equipment for our podcasting, fancy external, USB mic and headset and an arm to hold it and all that stuff. Guess what? I don't use it. What I have found is that I get good enough audio quality with this headset that I'm wearing for webinars, and I just didn't, especially in the time of COVID when we moved from our office, just was not worth it to me to keep all that equipment set up. I would say that we probably did spend a couple of $100s on the startup costs related to the equipment, but compared to what we pay for ongoing audio editing and such, it was a very small investment. So I do see a question here from Randy about the duration of seasons and the number of episodes in a season. Is doing 1 or 2 seasons a year with 7 to 10 episodes each enough frequency to help build and sustain an audience? It's an excellent question, Randy. What I've heard from people who have podcasted longer than I have is that it is very difficult to get momentum with audience, and they don't actually recommend taking many breaks between seasons, if any. The key to establishing and sustaining an audience is the frequency in terms of like the predictability of your posting. So what we did is we did our first season in 2020, and we did take a break. I think we took maybe 2 months off before we came back with the second season. And our plan now is only to take off maybe a week here or there and to try to have a steady stream of content weekly to be able to have a more predictable and sustainable audience. I think you can obviously experiment. And I think that also it's important to differentiate. There are plenty of podcasts who have a specific topic and they cover the topic, and it's an asset that's out there in the world, which is fine. But that's more of like an event than it is like an ongoing kind of content marketing approach. So, Randy, I hope that answered your question. And if it didn't, please feel free to, you know, clarify or ask something else. So just to address the people who worry about energy related to the podcast, I think we each kind of know ourselves and what it takes to sustain energy around investing in marketing or investing in anything. But I will tell you that I have found that for me, what helps me sustain energy around the podcast is the kind of interesting nature of my guests and that ability to connect with my guests. And also just I find a huge motivating factor in doing it in advance. So one of the places I got stuck early on was I would be recording like at the last possible minute, and there was all this like stress and pressure around, oh my goodness, I have to do a podcast. And poor Aubrey, who's on the call as our chat host, would kind of say like, are we going to get a podcast? And there was a lot of stress and pressure. So what we've been doing now is recording months in advance. So I can look at the calendar and know, we're set through, the foreseeable future, the next couple of months. We've already recorded all of those episodes, and that really frees me to be more creative and engaged. So, and yes, Randy, your comment makes perfect sense to me. It is the same or similar to having a successful blog. I would say the only difference is, with blogging, well, maybe it's not a difference. So I'm thinking out loud here, but a lot with blogging, I always say a week, one blog a week is about the minimum for creating traction. Now, I was going to say on podcasting, you can also do a bi-monthly podcast and have 2 episodes a month and still create traction. Now, I think if you have a daily podcast, sometimes a daily short podcast, obviously people know that you're going to have something new every day that can help you get there faster on sustainability. There are not that many people who can sustain a cadence of 5 days a week. So as with all my advice on any of these things, make a commitment to something you can stick with. If you can't stick to a weekly podcast, don't do a weekly podcast and disappear for months. Instead, do a monthly podcast or do a bi-monthly podcast. But I wouldn't recommend, going all great guns 5 days a week for 2 weeks and then, losing steam. So we are about 2/3 of the way through our time together. If you have any additional questions about starting a podcast, I would love to see those in the chat. But I think I'm going to transition for a few minutes and talk about being a guest on others' podcasts. So there are a bunch of benefits to being a guest on someone else's podcast. One is that they do all the heavy lifting that I just spoke about in terms of audio editing and post-production and, potentially marketing the event and all of that. So typically, if you're going to be a guest on a podcast, your only requirement is to show up with your best thinking and record the best possible interview that you can. And, for some of us, that requires some preparation time, but for most of us, we can show up and have a conversation on our topics, and it requires really relatively low effort compared to starting a podcast and what that requires. And this week we did have an episode with Case Lane on our podcast, and she talks about a DIY approach if you want to pitch yourself as a guest on podcasts. And she really has some great insights and some free resources available that really help you see exactly what to do on that. Some folks are successful in identifying podcasts for which they would make a great guest and pitching those hosts and being able to get those placements. I would say, as a podcast host myself, it is really obvious to me when someone pitches me to be a guest and they haven't listened to my podcast. And as you listen to Case, she'll give that advice that you do your research well to ensure that the podcast that you're pitching is a good fit for your content. And by all means, if you haven't listened to the podcast, don't say, I'm a big fan of your podcast, because I've gotten emails before where someone will say, I'm a big fan of your podcast, and then proceed to pitch me on something that is not related in the least little bit to what I talk about on my show. So, please don't do that. Please only find podcasts that are relevant, that you have something to add of value before you pitch a host, because you're not going to be successful pitching yourself if there's not a connection between the show and the topics on the show and the value that you have to offer as a guest. Let's see, I think, something else as a guest that I think is critically important is your willingness to market the episode. So quite often when I'm thinking about who to invite to be a guest on my podcast, I'm thinking about the content, of course, that the person might have to add, but I'm also at the same time thinking about whether or not that person has a great network and whether they can draw additional listeners to the episode as well. Um, so curious for any specific questions you have about being a guest on others' podcasts. Like I said, there definitely is that DIY approach that you can take, or you can hire a firm like mine to pitch you for podcasts, and we will research and identify the right ones and craft compelling pitches and follow up on those pitches to create as many opportunities for you as we can. And I think that this month, and I don't remember when it's going to drop, I did interview Eileen McDar. Eileen was a client of ours whose book came out last year, and we pitched her for a guest on podcasts. Her topic of resilience and burnout happened to be exceedingly relevant in this age of COVID. And we landed her 20, 30, I don't know, lots of wins on the podcast side. What we're finding right now is that our diverse clients, or clients who have a slightly edgier, different, unique message, are playing quite well in terms of being able to get podcast interviews. So Aubrey tells me that podcast with Eileen McDar is dropping the last week of the month. So you'll want to listen for that one if you want to hear about, using a partner to pitch for podcasts. So with just a couple of moments left, I'm going to keep looking for your questions in the chat, but I also want to show you a couple of slides with some ways that you can find out more about some upcoming events that may add value for you. So just quickly on the podcast services side, we have been partnering for a while with a podcast production company called Podfly. And Podfly provides a lot of guidance to people who are getting started with their podcasts on the strategy side, and on all the details that you need to cover in the beginning in terms of a logo for your podcast, those intros and outros, and music selection. And so if you're interested in working with Podfly, we do have a page on our website that outlines the parts that Podfly does, and then the marketing side is the part that my team and I provide. And So we'll give you a follow-up email that includes a link to our services related to podcasts. And, Podfly does have a very comprehensive approach. If you're only looking for audio editing services, or if you're looking for an alternative to Podfly, we also highly recommend Carrie Green and Podcast Fast Track, which is the service that we use to edit our audio files for our podcast. So if that's of interest, we'll provide that to you after the call. Next month's webinar is about best practices for author websites, and I'll be thrilled to be back with you for another 30-minute webinar on May 5th. If you are registered for this webinar, you are automatically registered for the next webinar. It is part of the series, so you will get a reminder. But if you have any friends who are authors who might benefit from the content on the next webinar, we would encourage you to invite them. We'll be looking at some great author websites. We'll be talking through the components that you want to include, and I welcome any questions via email in advance of that event, and I'll make sure that I plan my comments to address the specific questions that you have. So Elizabeth has a question of how to listen to our podcast. And Aubrey, if you can grab the link for our podcast, we'd love to share that with Elizabeth and everyone else who's listening. The other thing I want to let you know is that we do have an exciting live workshop coming in October, which, it's a long time from now. It's a 2-day, half-day event each day, and we are basically going to give you all the training you need for anything related to marketing your book. And it's going to be loads of fun because I'm going to be there, and hopefully you will too. And it's 12 to 5 Eastern with some breaks on October 14th and 15th, the Book Marketing Action Workshop. So I would encourage you to check that out today. We'll get you a link to it. I'm going to put up all of my social media links for you now. I would love to connect with you on all the places: Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Instagram happens to be my favorite fun channel right now. So I would love to connect with you there. I do see that there are a couple of more questions related to reasonable costs for starting up the podcast. Anna, that's a really great question. I don't know how to answer it. I do know that some of Podfly's startup packages are, $1,000 to $2,000 on all that kind of strategy side. We did not do that with our podcast. At Podcast Fast Track, where we get our editing, they fold in all the startup costs into the price of editing each individual episode. So rather than having a big upfront investment, we went for a higher price on each podcast getting edited. When you listen to my interview with Carrie Green, he says that, an average price for editing a podcast could be, he gave a range, and the top range was like $150 per episode for editing, and the low range was something much less than that. I can't remember the low number. And he also said that you get what you pay for as it relates to that professional audio editing. So hopefully that's helpful to you. I hope that I've answered some of your questions and given you a glimpse of what's possible as it relates to podcasting. I think this may be the first of these webinars that we've done since I got a contract on a book, and I'm just going to start talking about it. My book is coming in April of 2022. It is called Reach: Creating Lasting Impact for Your Book, Message, or Cause. And I'm halfway saying it just so that I can have it down by next year. Can those of you who are authors feel me on that? So hopefully you'll continue to join me on the journey for these upcoming webinars, and you'll be around when the book comes next April. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's always fun to have this time together, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Have a fantastic day.